my project, Climate, Kayak, and Conversation. Now, this is a project that I've started almost 2 years ago now, and I wanted to start out and find a way to help bridge some divides on the climate discussion here in the United States. As many of you know, the term climate change can kind of be a bit controversial for many. And so I wanted to figure out how to do that. And so I wanted to do some storytelling. So to kind of dive into things a little bit, climate change. I know it's a really hot button topic right now, but I think that's for good reason. We've got, for even outside of hurricane season, outside of fire season, we have things like this going on. This is sunny day flooding. We've also seen tons of news right now of the wildfires on the West Coast. They're getting longer, they're getting hotter, and they're getting more widespread. But then also here on the East Coast, we are smack dab in the middle of hurricane season right now. We're on letter V, I think right now, Vicky, and it's September, middle of September, September 18th. But something else that has not got as much attention in the wake of climate change is climate refugees. So people in coastal communities getting so affected by climate change that they literally have to leave their homes permanently. But in the case of coastal communities, there's a few things that are being affected. I'm personally saying this because I am located out here on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. I'm in Kill Devil Hills. So a lot of these things are very personal to me, as well as many of the other people that either visit the coast for fun, they have second homes out here, or they vacation here all the time. These are things that affect all of us. This usually comes up most often. When we have hurricanes come through, we have washout all the time. Houses are continuing to get flooded out, as well as more of our habitats are getting destroyed because of this saltwater intrusion that we're getting, that the salt water is getting into our marshes, destroying our marshes, which then is also more of a buffer to the inner banks, which many residents have both businesses as well as their homes there. And so for these industries, I'm not necessarily talking about like your small business coffee shop or grocery store. I'm talking about some of the businesses at the heart of the industry of our state here. Things like wastewater treatment plants are really oftenly set at low areas, as well as some of our major farming out here in the eastern end of the state, which is a really important part of our economy out here, that when these fields get flooded out by these rising floodwaters, there's not a whole lot coming back from that. But even when we do have flooding, this is then compounded by the fact that there are some places we can't even get to sometimes when our roadways wash out. But something that we all can kind of think about is why we even come to the Outer Banks, which we can call tourism. Tourism is the heart and soul of the economy out here, particularly on the Outer Banks. Hundreds of thousands of people visit the Outer Banks every year. And so that's how many of the people get their livelihoods out here. And so if we start to lose that due to climate change, then that also could mean the collapse of an entire economy. But we're all kind of feeling really down right now, I bet. So how do we talk about climate change when we always feel really down, depressed, mad, angry at the end? And some of those are absolutely valid thoughts and feelings because these impacts are really big. We can't really wrap our heads around them of it's just one event, it's just one thing here. It's such a grand idea that for so many people, it's so big, I can't deal with it. But then on top of that, what climate change means is ultimately a change in lifestyle. As almost all of us know, climate change and change of our own personal lives don't go well together. People don't like change. And most of that is also due to the fact that it challenges our worldviews. If you guys were at last year's conference, we had an entire workshop on worldviews. That's how important this is of our worldview, that the information that we receive in, we create our own worldview. If there's outside information that is starting to challenge that, more often than not, we shut down. So how do we start to open that up? How do we start to just talk about it, even let alone trying to convince people or provide evidence? How do we even just start that conversation when we have all of these things stacked up against us? Yes, okay, it's climate change. But for so many people, they're like, yeah, sure, but I've got a family to feed. I've got a job to hold. I've got bills to pay. Why do I want to care about this big thing? Because the only way we can do this is to talk about it. It's the only way to move forward. Because if we're not talking about it, then we're not moving forward. And what I mean by that is not just shouting facts out into the great beyond, the internet, but we need to have substantial conversations about it, because that's how we're all going to get to care. So often we like to tout and say that's 97% of scientists agree that humans are impacting climate change. But I bet you that we are far away from 97% as a society. So we need to start asking questions. So I want to draw you to this graph here that was done by the Pew Research Center. That there's a lot of different numbers going on here, but I want you to look at this top box. And there has two different kind of stats here of how people feel about what is contributing to global climate change. We have human activity and then natural patterns in the Earth environment. Even at human activity, we said 97% of scientists agree. As just general human activity, at best we're at 80%. Versus a great deal, which is 97% of that scientists, we're only at 49%. Even looking at natural patterns in the Earth's environment, we still have 80% of people believing that there's some amount of it. Even though it's less than a great deal than with human activity, we're still a long way to go before we're on the same page as the scientists. So I'm under the feeling right now that the science is there and we need to pivot a little bit more towards getting everyone else on board. And so how do we do that? We do that by bridging a divide. So I might be a person that really cares about climate change, who really has a passion that I want to change. And I come across somebody who is a little apprehensive. How do you bridge that divide? At our core, no matter who you are, our families, our homes, our jobs, where we work, what we do, what we love is important to us. And we all want to have a better life. And for those that have kids, we want to have our kids have a better life as well. So how do we help each other in that respect? You do that by finding common ground. So we may not agree on climate change, but we both love the ocean, right? Hey, let's talk about the ocean. You love fishing? I love fishing too. Where is that one common point that you can start a conversation on to then work off of that? Because if you know that you can't start here of this really controversial topic, start somewhere that you can all agree upon and work your way there. And I keep saying climate change because words matter. But also, I say words matter because of the times that you don't say climate change. Because climate change is a really hot button topic, and people immediately as they hear climate change, they rear back. So how do you start to talk about climate change without saying the word climate change? And that's a big focus for my project, that in my interviews that I'm doing, I will not even mention the words climate change until probably the second half of my interview. Because many of the people that I'm talking to aren't 100% on board with that. So how do I get them to talk about the aspects, the effects, and the emotions of climate change without having to actually say that? We do that through storytelling and asking questions. Asking questions like, what was it like when you moved here? So we're talking about an environment in the past and how it has changed over time. What is climate change, but how our climate has changed over time? And now we're already talking about climate change without ever saying those two words. And so once you start that, you're like, oh man, like there were way less houses here, or there were, the beach was way bigger, or there were more fish. Those kinds of things start leading you into a more deeper conversation. So these are some pictures from some of my conversations I've already had to talk a little bit about storytelling. Storytelling is more about informing. So there could be some people that would be like, well, yes and no. Storytelling is about connecting, because once you connect with people, then you can start to get them to care. Once you start getting them to care about something, then you can start informing them. If they don't care, giving them information is just like throwing that information away. It's going to go one ear and out the other, because for them, they make no connection to it. You have to find a way to make that information connect with them so that it will stay with them. As well as having a conversation allows to have a more relaxed setting versus here, this might feel a little bit more formal than all of us sitting around a circle and chatting or in a classroom setting. That here, you can sit here relaxed in your backyard with a neighbor or maybe at lunch with some fellow students or with some of your students or something like a relaxed time, a more informal setting helps people put some of those barriers down. And once you can start to do that, they start to take those barriers down, then you can start to make some of those connections. And like I said, once you create a connection, it allows them to care. Once you get them to care, then you can start to get them to act. And that's ultimately what we want out of climate change is we want people to act and make changes in their lives to help prevent and stop the climate change. Now, I want to say this is not a replacement for fact-based education. This is really important as a additional part to it. That we have our fact-based education, we have our informal education, our formal education, all of that is really important. But storytelling needs to become a part of it to allow both our youth and our adult students to continue to connect. That if we just keep saying the same facts over and over and over, we still aren't making those connections. That we might make a connect from one thing to another, but are we making the connections from those to our students? And so if we're able to use storytelling about things that are happening in our local environment, things that are happening in our country, then that might allow us to start moving forward. Both are incredibly important, and they cannot exist without the other. That storytelling is great, but if you don't have it without then following up with the education, then you're kind of losing out here. So it's important that we use both of them as they are intended to. And I think they can work really well together. But I keep talking about storytelling. And there's really two kinds of storytelling. There's the storytelling that I'm doing with my project that I'm connecting with someone individually. You can even consider some of this as I'm telling my story to you individually. But there's some other kinds of storytelling that work really well for a greater audience. And I'll get into that in just a second. Both of them have their place and their pros and cons because I think one can help inform the other as well as one can help lead to the other. So the first one, connecting on a personal level. Like I said, this is what I'm doing for my project. This is another one of my clips from one of my interviews. And so that allows us to start sharing more of our stories. That I can share a story, then they can share a story, and back and forth, and that creates that connection. And once you share something personal, that opens you up. And then often when someone receives something that was personal from someone they're talking to, that they will then inherently open up. And once you start opening up and you can start sharing that kind of content of how we feel about how things are happening right now, then we can start to steer that conversation towards a greater connection between the two people, as well as then a greater connection with this topic, whether it be climate change or even a smaller topic within climate change. But then also creating and connecting with a larger audience. So this is one that where you use someone else's story to connect. So this is more often seen done as a documentary. You have one person, you follow their story as they progress through some kind of adventure or event or story. So an example I would give would be something like Netflix's documentary Chasing Coral. So I've seen it, and I'm sure a few of you have seen it as well. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. But it really goes into the story of a couple of guys following the health of a coral reef over a period of time. And what that ends up allowing them to do is they can see the story of the coral reef. So you get that story element as well. But then on top of it, you see the story of the people following the coral reef. Now you can see with my pictures at the bottom that, yeah, this kind of deals with coral bleaching. So you get to see someone go through the emotions of watching a coral reef bleach. And so that is another aspect of climate change that it really hits home for that person. And since you see them opening up, it then creates an emotional response in you. When you're doing your storytelling and you're having your conversations, allow someone to tell their story. Let me tell you, people love to talk. You get them set off on one thing, they will talk for ages. And so once you get them started on something, then you're golden. And you'll see almost in any conversation. And I encourage you to do this next time you're talking with someone of watch their face, watch their facial expressions as they talk. Because more often than not, if you find them that they get excited about something, face is gonna light up and they're gonna get super excited. Their voice is gonna rise, they're gonna start talking faster. Once you find that thing, capitalize on it. I cannot tell you how many of my best conversations and best segments of conversations have been when I asked a question that I thought was gonna be maybe I just popped into my head and I asked that question and they just lit up. Those are some of the best points. Once you get into that conversation and maybe you find that point of it really lights them up, find that common ground that get them to open up and then make that connection, because then you've got two things going for you. You've got the connection and you've got them excited. Once you can do those two, then you can really start being really forward in your conversation. But it's also important to be open and be honest. It's really important that you don't put on a face for these conversations. I tell everyone in my conversations of why I care, why I'm doing this before I even get into the meat of the conversation. It's because I do this because I care about my planet, I care about my earth, and I care about the conversations that we have, because that is how we function in society. And we're a society of storytellers. At our core, we're all storytellers. And I think that is the best way that we can really start to move forward. And they don't have to be like you. They don't have to think like you. They don't have to have the same ideas with you. Just having a conversation in of itself can be some of the most important things. So, kind of starting to draw things closer to the end here of some of the things that I've learned thus far. And this is just of what I've learned in my first 200 miles of my project, as well as some of the video work that I've done during as well as afterwards. This can be said for not just this project, not just for education, but anything in general. But starting a conversation with a stranger, which is pretty much everything I've done for this project, starting a conversation with a stranger can be really awkward and can kind of be hard to start. So I found generally asking a person about their day, really simple questions, just breaking the ice. It's a really great way to start that conversation. Because once you've started it, you're like, oh, okay, got that awkwardness out of the way. Now we can start to move forward. But also on the topic of climate change and the emotions and what we think of it, it is not a black and white issue at all. I've seen everything from total climate skepticism of it's this government conspiracy to absolutely humans are causing it, we need to do everything we can, to I'm not sure how much humans are affecting it versus Earth, but it's definitely something we need to care about, and it's all over the board. And so what we need to do is realize that it's not a yes, no, black and white, accepting versus denial. It's all a gray area, and learning how to kind of dance around those kinds of different positions and approach them in certain ways based on the stories that these people are telling will help us create a better community. But just continue to be yourself. Please just be yourself, because as soon as you stop being yourself, people automatically realize, oh, they were just putting on a persona. And usually with that as well, you're not going to get as genuine of a response. That if you are genuine, oftentimes you'll get genuine back. And sometimes it can be kind of awkward of talking about how I personally feel in a professional situation. I totally get that. But even outside of your professional work, just in your community, in with your neighbors, your kids, friends, parents, whatever it might be, in your general life, be yourself. Talk about the things that worry you, talk about the things that you're hopeful for as well. Please don't forget hope, because the only way that we're going to continue to push forward on these conversations is for us to continue to have hope of a better world. And we're always doom and gloom, then we've already fulfilled we've fulfilled our own prophecy. So continue to have hope. I've already said this a bunch of times, but please always be honest and open. It will serve you dividends more than you will ever realize. As well as keep the camera running. That I cannot tell you how many times that I've had the camera running and be like, all right, that was great, and stop recording. And then I get this great line out of them. And this can be said for whether you're having a Zoom call or if you're talking with students. Basically, push the conversation as far as you can. And just when you think it might be over, it's probably not. And so just allow them to keep talking usually. That they'll end up on a train of thought and just help them work that along. And usually you'll get to something pretty great. But I want to end it with things that we can do, things that you can do to help this along. Yes, I'm working my project here, but there's things that all of us can do to make this better. First off, it's our job to be an inclusive community. That if you meet somebody, if you talk with somebody and it kind of seems that they're on the fence about climate change or global warming or any topic that you believe the opposite of, that's not the time to shut them down. That's not the time to walk away. It's the time to engage with them. It's really hard to start that conversation sometimes, but we have to. And so it's our job, particularly in the EE community, to be as inclusive as we can, both in the form of viewpoints, but then also of looking at people of all backgrounds, all ages. It's just good all around, but also to listen more. We are educators. We talk a lot, and many of us are introverts as well. I would say I'm a little bit of an introvert, but also it's important for us to listen more. Not just have people talk, but to listen ourselves. And always ask for questions. I love questions. I love asking questions. I love also being asked questions. So as well, side note, if you guys have any questions, drop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to answer these at the end. But also, please just ask more questions. I think we can all do a little bit better from asking our own questions rather than sharing our own opinions, because the questions, I think, end up sharing a little bit more for everyone. And I think something that we can do really substantively is starting incorporating storytelling into our curricula. So we can have informational programs, we can have informational parts, fact-based parts of talking about some of the effects of climate change, but I think there's also an important aspect to be had with climate change education and just education in general to talk about how we feel about certain things and what things are happening in our local communities that are being affected. I want to say thank you all so much for listening and engaging with me in this project and in our community here. I want to open up the floor to anyone that has any questions.